And we're back with more of the Gator and Denise Show, presented by Len Benton Tractor on 1430 KYKN.
All systems stable. Stand by.
Now, here's Gator and Denise.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you along for the ride. Hour number 2 gets rolling right now, and I tell you what, this is going to be fun.
Yes.
I think so, and
kind
I
of geeking out about this.
Kind of doing it. Before we do that, hour 1 is wrapped up and in the can, and according to Hunter at HalfPriceOregon.com, for no other reason except that he's the man. It is available for podcast listening at KYKN.com. There's no more any reasons. There's no more thumbs. There's no more smiles. There's no more looking through the window. We just know it's done because he's the man.
Yeah.
All right, you owe me $20 for making me say that. I don't know why I had to do that. That must be something for his kids. He wanted me this time to say that, so there you go.
He's the man.
He's the man. See, you got 4 of them in there. 4, he's the man. 5.
That's so toxic.
Dang it.
Toxic masculinity.
Well, whatever we have to do to make it
surrounded by it again.
Stop. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. All right, so a few weeks ago, you were rather excited, Denise, about running across an article, and you printed off a copy, and you pretty much... There was no question to it. You're like, you have to read this.
Yeah, you need to read this. So we have James Masnov here, who approached me a couple weeks ago, and you wrote this paper and asked me to read it, and I did, and wow. So welcome to the program, James.
Thank you.
So this paper is, I'll read the title of it, The Power of Nine, Federalists, Anti-Federalists, and Natural Law Synthesis in the Ninth Amendment. So I shared it with Gator, and we both read it, and it was like, wow. Yeah, we need to have James on to have a nice light chat about the Ninth Amendment and natural law.
It's so small. I mean, the Ninth Amendment.
It's well, let's read it, shall we?
You should read it, because it will take you all of 4 seconds.
Let's start there. The Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
All right, so here's the modern, simple 10-year-old version for this, okay? Mm-hmm. Just because there's a list of rights in the Constitution doesn't mean that the government can take away other rights of the people that are not listed in the Constitution.
Right. The list is not exhaustive.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the simple way of putting that in. So where do you want to start with this?
Well, first of all, okay, you wrote this great paper. Where do you go to school? What did you write?
It was my senior thesis at Western Oregon, where I graduated in June.
Okay.
So this was the paper that I worked on for the better part of a year.
Yeah.
Researching and writing and many different
I can
drafts.
tell. I mean, it's cited. It's super well written, and you wouldn't think necessarily that it would be riveting reading, but I sat down with this and I read it all the way through in a setting and really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it.
And the amendment is not, the Ninth Amendment is one of those that you never hear about.
Yeah. It's not a sexy amendment.
No, it's not. And I almost think that it's maybe the most important, actually, because the rights retained by the people, that undergirds what we call natural law.
Yeah.
That is what natural law is. So, and we can go a little bit more into that if
actually, yeah, it's a term that kind of gets bandied about, but maybe a lot of people don't really understand what it all entails and what it means. If you could maybe explain a little bit of that.
Right. So, probably most famously, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence the most telling line that some of us remember is that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that is natural law. Natural law is the idea that rights precede government. If we had no government whatsoever, we would still retain our individual rights. And this was basically how the history of the U.S. kind of governmental philosophy was up until arguably the progressive era, the early 20th century.
Yep.
And so for about the past 100 years, that's been flipped, and this term called legal positivism is what's kind of been most popular for the past century, and it's completely the inverted version, which is the idea that rights come from government, that we construct government to then endow us with our rights. And that is so antithetical to kind of the founding philosophy, and I'm really intrigued by that we know this, at least some of us know that this is the history, and it's even taught when you actually get into constitutional law and constitutional philosophy. This is still talked about, but then there's this kind of philosophical gymnastics that happen with certain professors, certain scholars who then want to kind of make excuses for why the practice doesn't fit the philosophy.
Well, it's interesting because you see it in media too.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, because Roy Moore has been in the news so much, but I think when Roy Moore won the nomination or something, he came out and made a comment about inalienable rights are endowed by our creator. And I think it was Jake Tapper who just was aghast at that and kind of looked at him like, well, doesn't this dude know that our rights come from government?
Right.
So it's permeated culture as well.
Yes.
Which is unfortunate because it's not true.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some people get put off by natural law because the kind of metaphysical aspects of it is something that especially atheistic thinkers have problem with. And actually, I was really happy that a colleague of mine who's both a conservative and an atheist asked me, how do I wrestle with this? I don't understand how I can accept this as an atheist. I said, well, that's a really good question. And to me, you don't have to believe in the metaphysical aspect of it, that we're endowed by creator. It's what I believe. And I think most people who ascribe to natural law believe that. But as long as you believe in the notion of private property rights, then all of natural law speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Because the very way that we can define rights is by defining what belongs to you and what belongs to me. And that is how we define rights. And the people who have a problem with kind of natural law's maybe metaphysical aspects, they don't even have to deal with that if they don't want to. You can see the practical application in the way that property rights are used.
Well, you talk about with the progressive era starting at the early part of the very early 20th century, which does not ascribe to that. I mean, it's completely the opposite of that. And so we've seen how that's played out. And so when you're really looking at two different worldviews that are now competing for the hearts and minds of Americans, so to speak, it almost seems like the progressive, just given culture and education, academia seems to be winning, frankly. Oh yeah, absolutely, and has been for at least 50 years. Probably the better part of a century, and it goes in waves. And it's not always along party lines either. Yeah. Oh, absolutely correct. Yeah, for sure. I mean, The first progressive Republican was Teddy Roosevelt. You have to go back 100 years, but he helped start this. And there are aspects. I'm okay with the national parks and things like that. There is a place for government. I'm not an anarchist. But good to know. But there is. Well, you'd be surprised in kind of academic settings how much different kind of strains of anarchism are bandied about, and it's pretty incredible. But so I'm not somebody saying that there's not a role for government, but it's kind of a natural notion of natural law to be suspicious of government. And Jefferson and Madison talked about these things, that it makes sense to be suspicious of government, especially when government is built by human beings. Yeah, yeah. And it's a very natural, a very practical way of looking at human existence. But I think that explains the difference between kind of a progressive view and a natural law view, is that progressives want to believe that people are inherently good, while natural law believes that there's something to be, suspect about human nature. So those are two really polar opposite views, and I think that's why we're seeing such conflict in society. I mean, can they coexist? Very uncomfortably, as we've seen. I don't know. There's a lot that is troubling about this stuff, because people often aren't even necessarily very clear about their own thoughts, including office holders, who will even give kind of natural law, they'll give it lip service, but in their actions and in their policies, they don't believe it at all. And when you see office holders actually use terms like, we're going to give people the right to XYZ, that shows that they're not understanding what natural law is about. We already have those rights, rights retained by the people, and it is up to government to prove why they need a power that might obstruct some of those rights. The onus is on the government. It is not on the people.
We see that conversation a lot, especially here in Oregon, when it comes to the Second Amendment, when it comes to gun rights. That seems to be an argument that comes up quite frequently. Definitely. From those who are, I would call anti-Second Amendment, anti-gun, our right to defend ourselves, is they are kind of stepping in with that same indication that you're talking about, James, where they say, look, you don't have this right. Right. And it's like, no, we have the right. We understand your concerns about people abusing the right. Sure. But the issue is not the right. The issue is the abuse.
Well, even the terminology is kind of strange to me, because often liberal and radical is ascribed to the left, whereas I would think that the Second Amendment, the right to protect yourself against the tyranny of your own government, there's nothing more liberal or radical than that, and that's something that should be celebrated. And that really shows how a lot of these these terms have really been manipulated.
Yeah, there's been a definite flip. We frequently refer to the 100-year mark, where about 100 years ago, everything just kind of flipped.
Classical
Absolutely.
liberalism, I would say I'm probably more in line with a classical liberal, just in my beliefs. Probably
Yes,
all three
me
of
too.
us would be
Yep.
in that line. But yes, and words do matter, and the progressive left has been very good about sort of stealing words and changing the meanings, and then, okay, that one's all now been dirtied up, and we got to toss that away, and let's grab a new one.
Right, absolutely. And to be fair, one of my issues that I have sometimes with conservative media is when they do the same thing.
Yeah.
And they'll conflate liberal and left, and it's like, ugh, don't do that. I am very much I am a liberal, I'm not a leftist.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen more and more people, there are figures like Dave Rubin, if you're familiar
Yep.
with him, who have been very good about making that distinction. I think we have a long way to go.
I do too, because right now, unfortunately, the phrase liberal, because it has been hijacked and its definition has been changed. When you say liberal for the general sense, you think left, and so
Right.
they become synonymous. While we are doing deep word play here, the reality is, in today, the right has been associated with conservative, and the left has been attached to liberal.
Yeah.
And so now it's like, okay, we either make the change or we try to change everyone to go back to the way it used to be.
I'm actually seeing some talking heads, pundits start trying to use the word left. I tend to try to use left and progressive.
Yes, me too.
Because I don't even think conservative or Republican and Democrat are becoming, to me, kind of meaningless anymore. Because, like you said, progressivism, it's that ideology, it's that thought process, that worldview, that has infected both on both sides. So that's, I think, the wrong conversation to have.
Which is where we get ourselves in some trouble sometimes when
Right.
we will say, well, there's progressives on both the Republican and the Democrat side, the right and the left, and inevitably someone's hair gets lit up on fire, and we get some nasty email about, what? No, progressivism is only on the liberal side. It's only on the left side.
Right.
No,
it's not.
no. All right, let's take a quick breather. We're talking to James Masnov about a great, very lengthy, but really well written paper about thesis about the Ninth Amendment. That's the short version of it. We'll take a breather. We'll come back with more of this fascinating study of one of the shortest amendments. I love that.
The most unsexy amendment of all.
All right, we'll talk about that when we come back on 1430 KYKN.
Hey Oregon, I'm America's Digital Pro, Kim Commando. Get the latest for all things digital in my Consumer Tech Update coming up shortly. Now, more of the Gator and Denise Show on 1430 KYKN.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you along for the ride. This segment brought to you by Mid-Valley Linux. Wade and Tina over there love what we do here at the show and at the station. Have been supporting us for years. But more importantly, now that the rainy season has kicked in, they can help you protect the bed lining of your truck. Get that taken care of. That way you don't have cracks, bubbles, flakes, whatever you want to call it in the back of your truck.
Like Denise.
Like in your truck?
Yeah.
Oh, well, your truck has issues
It's old.
all around.
I should have way back in the day had
Yeah.
Mid-Valley Linux.
Because then right now your bed in your truck would be in better
beautiful,
shape
it would be pristine and lovely.
than it is now. Well, the rest of the truck needs
I'm a
little
cautionary tale.
bit of, take her advice. This is what you could have.
Get the bed liner.
Don't do that. Mid-Valley Linux, find them on Silverton Road. Look for the big yellow sign right next to the railroad tracks and the state fairgrounds, and on Facebook as well. All right, joining us in the third chair, James Masnov, who wrote this great thesis, which we read a few weeks ago, and you've been gracious enough to join us in the third chair for a further discussion about this. I want to start this segment off with a quote from Judge Robert Bork, who called the Ninth Amendment a, quote, meaningless inkblot
Yes.
on the Constitution.
What?
Yeah, and what I actually find most fascinating about that is that was one of the things that helped sunk his nomination for the Supreme Court. So you have to go back to the 1980s when it was the Democrats who cared about the Ninth Amendment. It was the Democrats who cared about rights retained by the people. And so, again, you have this flip happening where probably right now, if anybody's talking about the Ninth Amendment, they're probably classical liberals or libertarians. And this it's very interesting, and arguably, I'm trying to not get too wonky here, but basically from the mid-1960s through the 80s, you usually had modern liberals, progressives, arguing for rights retained by the people, the Ninth Amendment, because of the legal decisions that came out of that. Now, the Ninth Amendment lay dormant for over 150 years. It's another really unique thing about it. It was ratified in 1791. It wasn't asserted by the Supreme Court till 1965.
Wow.
In Griswold. The Griswold case was a birth control case. And it was out of that we started seeing kind of the expansion of the right of privacy.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the right of privacy is not an enumerated right. It's not specifically written in the Constitution, but most of us would generally agree that we have individual rights of privacy. Well, so this was something that was championed by the Democrats from the 60s through the 80s, and it was something that helped sink Robert Bork's nomination because he seemed to think that the Ninth Amendment and unenumerated rights was silly. Like you said, he compared it to an ink blot. I would argue that probably today, 30 years later, you're more likely to find Democrats that would criticize the Ninth Amendment and call it an ink blot than you would a conservative or a libertarian. That's just my opinion.
Interesting, because I've seen the Griswold decision kind of trotted out again to bolster a point that someone on the left was making. So,
in what regard?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I can't think of it now. It was in a Facebook thread.
Okay. Well, I can.
And Griswold got brought up, and I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I can probably tell you why Griswold is attacked and championed at the same time, which is that it helped lead to Roe v. Wade.
Right. And it was in that context that it was brought up.
I kind of thought it probably was because you, again, have the right to privacy.
Yeah.
I personally think there's a huge divide between the right of privacy in terms of somebody, especially in that case, it was a married couple using birth control, and the right to terminate, a life. I think, no matter what one thinks about abortion, I think you can objectively say those are two very different issues, and so to conflate them, I think is, I don't know. In my opinion, it's disingenuous.
It was made by that point was brought up by a law professor.
Yeah. Well, and you're right. The whole Griswold, Connecticut, leading up to the Roe v. Wade, and yes, even today you'll still hear that argument as far as, hey, this is privacy. It's a woman's privacy. It's a woman's right. It's a woman's body.
Right.
That was the argument that was used for the longest time. And I would agree with you on a personal note that this is your privacy and what you do in your bedroom.
Sure.
You're absolutely right. You have that privacy, but now you're involving someone else's life.
Right, and I would argue that is the very important distinction that they want to leave out.
They do leave it out.
Of course, yeah, it makes it a very different thing.
Yes.
It's a blob. It sells.
It's an ink blot.
It's an ink blot.
Well, but that's what I think is so interesting is that the Bork.
Did you just call him a Borg?
I did.
A simulation.
Bork's thinking of his nomination and partly it being due to his rejection of the Ninth Amendment. I think you would very much see the opposite today. I think you see conservatives understanding that because of their suspicion of government, classical liberals, this is also true, a healthy suspicion of government versus an ideology, which is what progressivism is, that government is the answer. So of course you're going to have a very different view of the Ninth Amendment for that very reason.
Yeah, very true. And now with the, you made references earlier, James, about the government and the government's role. We frequently pound on the fact that the federal government specifically has 4 things they're supposed to be doing. And when it comes to the Ninth Amendment, when it comes to the privacy issue, when it comes to them getting involved in other rights, it's not one of those 4 things.
Almost never.
Yeah, they're not supposed to be doing this. We've kind of lost where the role has come, and today in our show post on social media, we used a diagram that shows a pyramid, and it shows the foundation under the ground, and it starts down way, way, way deep underground with natural law, which then grows up to we the people, which grows up to, and then it starts from the very basic local, and then works us all the way, and all the way at the top is the federal government.
Right. It's
smaller, it's at the top. And I love that analogy with the pyramid because, sure, it's at the top, and so it has more visibility. And there's kind of an assumption that, well, it's at the top, it must be the most important. When the reality is, it's the smallest part of the entire pyramid.
Right, certainly should be.
And it's the weakest part of the entire thing. It cannot be on its own. It could not support the rest of it, whether it goes down to state, county, city government, down to we the people, down to natural law.
Right.
And so I think we have, in a sense, we the people have allowed for that little tiny part of the top and the parts between us, state and county and even city government, to have more authority over us instead of remembering that everything is supposed to be, you're serving us, we the people.
Right, which is one of the limitations and concerns about pure democracy, right? That is the problem here, and the progressive view is that democracy is kind of an inherent good, and I think there's a problem with that. If you remember, the paper opens with a John Adams quote, where he compares democracy to a tyranny, and that was a very natural view, and during the founding, and I believe it is sensible to this day to be suspicious not just of government but of mob mentality and mob rule.
But you see, again, kind of tying this back into popular culture and what we're witnessing today, and what the sort of the mantra and the meme that's pushed out there. I mean, almost every newscast I ever watch, regardless of the network, you're hearing us referred to as a democracy.
Right.
Very rarely do you hear us referred to as a republic, much less even trying to define what those things mean. So if you just, again, you say it over and over and over again, well, we're a democracy. And people don't really understand what that is, and that's intentional.
Well, it's interesting because it's the whole logical fallacy of the bandwagon argument. You see it, like you say, on the news all the time. Yeah. Well, 80% of the people agree with this. There's got to be somebody else sitting next to them saying, "So what?" You know, does it accord with individual rights? If it doesn't, then we really need to think about this. And that part of the conversation is often left out.
Yeah, it is.
All right, we're going to take a quick breather, come back. There's so much more to go over with this as we're talking with our third chair guest, James Masnov, when we return on 1430 KYKN.
And we're back with more of the Gator and Denise Show, presented by Len Benton Tractor on 1430 KYKN.
All systems stable. Stand by.
Now, here's Gator and Denise.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you along for the ride. This segment brought to you by Jackman Wealth Management, LLC. Rob's helping you out with those retirement plans. No matter what your age is, no matter what you have or don't have in the bank account, he can help you out with those plans. In this day and age, especially if you're not one of those who's looking forward to, like, hey, I'm going to collect some PERS, or I'm going to collect a 401k, or I'm going to collect, okay, maybe I'm not going to collect either of those anyways. With things being so unstable, maybe you need to figure out what the alternate Plan B plan is. Rob Jackman can help you out with that. Get a hold of him online at jackmanwm.com. Joining us in the third chair, James Masnov, who wrote this fantastic thesis. And I don't mind saying that in front of you. I don't want to make you blush, but you deserve it. It is a document that Denise had brought. She made me read it, which I did not mind. I don't mean to put it in... But it was one of those
to read.
I love.
Well, I know. Who does that anymore?
What?
My God.
Paper? This isn't on Kindle. I'm a big reader, and she knows that. I'm a big history person. She knows that. She ran across it, and she's like, "Oh, you've got to read this." We read it, and when the opportunity came to have you here for the conversation, it was an easy yes. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Denise, where do you want to go with this? So you've got so many notes on
I
this.
do. I have all kinds of little sticky notes on this and lots of yellow highlighter. One of the things you bring up was Jefferson talking to Mercy Otis Warren. And term limits came up. And term limits has been a conversation that we've had off and on as we go through, because I know we were talking about our senators, Wyden and Merkley, and I said yesterday I'd be okay if we had term limits for just them. But I don't necessarily think term limits are the way to go. And the reason why is it's giving away yet one more right that we have, one more source of power that we have in controlling who our representatives are. We're putting it off onto somebody else to decide that. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where did Mercy and Otis Warren come down on that, and did it mesh with her contemporaries?
Well, Mercy Otis Warren is one of my favorite figures of the founding era. She's one of the few women who really had a voice at that time. And she is now lumped in what they call the Anti-Federalists, who were members of the founding fathers or founding generation who did not want a new constitution.
Let's back up a little bit then,
Yes.
because you're talking about Federalists, Anti-Federalists. And I know
Right.
we'll put term limits over here for a second, because I think we need to go back a little bit. A lot of people don't understand what a Federalist is, and that it wasn't that a bunch of guys in white powdered wigs got together and slapped each other on the back and said good job and got this done like in an afternoon.
No.
There was a lot of conflict, which we don't have to go into all of that. Can you talk a little bit about, define those two things, Federalist, Anti-Federalist?
Yeah. Well, so to keep it simple, the Federalists were the revolution had been won. We had gained our independence. The Federalists thought there needed to be a stronger central government, a stronger, what we now call a federal government. And these people are most famously people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. They're the ones who wrote what's now called the Federalist or the Federalist Papers, which was a series of essays arguing why we need a new constitution,
so they were
a stronger. They were Publius, right? Okay. And then you had the camp who were opposed to them, and they came to be called the Anti-Federalists. There's irony in that because really the Federalists were arguing for a stronger central government, so the Federalists were technically Anti-Federalists, which made the Anti-Federalists technically Federalists. So it gets kind of confusing.
It's a little muddy.
Yeah.
Especially when you're taking a test.
You're right. But Mercy Otis Warren was an Anti-Federalist. She didn't want a new constitution. And one of her problems with the proposed constitution was that there were no term limits. She thought that term limits made sense because it made office holders more responsible to the people because they knew that their time was limited. And so what I'm really interested in about term limits specifically is how that is an issue that does not always fall upon party lines. There are people on either side of that issue in any party.
Yes.
And that fascinates me. But one of the criticisms, and I think you kind of spoke to this a second ago, one of the criticisms of the concept of term limits is that it's anti-democratic. You know, it's stop me before I vote again. Yeah, is what it is. And I go back and forth on the issue, which I think is why I'm so fascinated with it. I can completely side with either side of that argument because it is anti-democratic. But I have no problem with saying that there are some things, individual rights being among them, that are not. I don't care if 90% of the people support it or don't support it. There are principles that are more important than majority rule, and that's a philosophy that the founders understood. Nowadays, when we constantly call the United States a democracy, and we live kind of in the era of progressivism, that notion often gets lost. And so I think term limits is interesting because you really see the divide there between what is the balance between the will of the people and what protects individual rights. And again, I could go either way on this. So I'm interested in how you two fall on this because...
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well, I can see both sides of it, and I can actually agree with both sides of it, which makes it an interesting place to be in because I could go either way on it. I tend to go towards we are so quick in this society, especially currently, to cede our rights for the sake of a little security or because we're lazy or because we don't want to take the time to learn about it or make the effort. That to me seems like just one more thing where we're going to give it away because it's convenient, it's easy. We know they're only going to be in there for a certain amount of time. We don't have to participate in the process. That's where I lean that it's not okay because of that.
Well, I think all of us would agree that if we, the people, were doing this the way we should be doing this, the term limits would be done at the ballot box.
Right.
Yeah. And that if a person was holding any office and was not fulfilling the job based upon the majority of the people in the area who were like, hey, we want you to be doing this, you're supposed to be representing us, you're not doing a good job, therefore we're going to find someone else to do your job.
I have another concern, too, that I thought about, because if you have somebody that's termed out, on the one hand, you can say that they can actually sort of vote their conscience, so that they don't have another election hanging over their head where they may have to pander or something like that. It frees them up. But the other side of it is if you limit terms, so you're constantly changing the cast of characters that are in there, the only constant is the lobbyist.
Right.
And the paid people and the bureaucrats and the wonks. And to me, that administrative state is a very frightening thing. So if you're giving them, these unelected, unaccountable people, all the power underneath,
right,
I think that defeats the purpose of having a representative government.
And I think part of it, I'm sorry, I think part of it, if you, because I was just thinking as you're saying, if we decrease the glamour of being a politician, and we went back to what it was supposed to be, kind of like, I always compare it to jury duty. It's like, it's part of your American duty, it's part of your right, it's an inconvenience, it's not always fun, but most Americans accept it as, well, this is part of being an American. If there was more of that kind of viewpoint with public office, whether it was a local, school board or all the way up to the President of the United States, where it's like, well, this isn't what I'm normally doing, I'm going to go do this for a time. And it's just like a designated time, and then maybe they get in there and they do it really well. And people go, you know what? You're really good at this. You listen to the people. You represent us well. We'd love for you to do this more. But if we made it less glamorous, where it was harder work, it was, not as sexy, didn't get as much money, maybe not as much benefits, maybe we could help create we could get rid of the career politicians. Because a lot of career politicians are like, I got power. Yeah. I got money. I mean, I walk in the room and I get, hello, sir. Hello, ma'am.
Was it politics is Hollywood for ugly people?
Right. And it's always the honorable so-and-so.
Right.
When often there's nothing honorable about them.
Where they're sort of elevated and put on this pedestal. And you talk about it, too, when you say, well, they're not leaders, they're servants.
Right.
And we've lost that servant government. And I think if we did get back to that, perhaps term limits wouldn't be necessarily. What's your take on... Do you think we're probably going to slowly move in that direction of term limits? The populace is going to cry out for it?
I think it's going to be like the past 20 to 30 years, which is a lot of talk about it and it never happening.
Kind of like the third bridge.
Right.
Yeah,
I've noticed the trend.
Very much like that.
And James, tell me if you've noticed this as well. I noticed the trend of who is screaming the loudest for term limits is usually the opposite party of who's in control.
Yeah.
Whoever's in power.
Yes.
So if the Democrats are in and then it's been going out of hand, like here in Oregon, you got a bunch of Republicans who are like, oh, we should do term limits. And then it switches around where the Republicans, like on a national level right now, you get Democrats, we should really revisit that conversation about term limits. It's always convenient when the other guy is in power.
Well, it's the same thing with being constitutionalists. Republicans have become constitutionalists again. After 8 years of Barack Obama, and Democrats are just beginning to. All of a sudden, they believe in federalism. You have the stuff going on with sanctuary cities and things like that. They all of a sudden believe in local control when they didn't for the better part of a decade. And so, also with kind of acting as though they have any fidelity to the Constitution, it's the same thing.
Yeah, we've had that fun conversation where we're like, hey, now that there's a president that Democrats don't like, can we sit down and on a basic just agree with the fact that we think the executive branch of government, federally speaking, has too much power.
Right.
And it's interesting because now all of a sudden that's the common ground. They go, well, yeah, I can agree with that. You know what's weird is like a year and a half ago, you didn't agree with me.
Exactly.
Because your candidate, your party president was in office. And at that time, you're like, well, no, he's doing a great job.
Right.
And those are good conversations to have one-on-one, and I've had many of those. But we were talking earlier about how tribal everything has become. I almost wonder if we're past the point of no return where we can't even have that conversation anymore.
I hope not, because that's really the definition of true liberalism.
Yeah.
Is the idea to be able to exchange ideas even when you disagree, especially when you disagree. And if we continue to walk down this road of not being able to talk to each other because we disagree politically, that doesn't bode well.
No, not at all. It's interesting because that comes up a lot of times. I'll have someone on the left who will throw out the definition of liberal, and they just go, well, this is what we are, and this is why you are not this. And, I'll read them like, agree. And it throws them.
Wait,
They're
what?
like, wait, you agree? You're a liberal? I'm like, no. I'm agreeing with the definition you just put out there.
Right.
Or that you gave to me maybe over a coffee. I'm like, well, I would agree with that. They're like, so you're a liberal? Whoa, stop with the labels, because when you say liberal, you're talking about modern liberal. I'm talking about classic. And the problem is as a lot of modern liberals, they will go back and pull the old definition without really letting it sink in. That's not you.
Right.
You are not this. You are giving me this classic definition of liberalism, but that's not you at all.
Well, not when modern liberalism is not liberal if it's telling you, what kind of guns you can or cannot have, and at this point even telling you what you can and cannot say.
Yeah.
That's not liberal.
No, it's not.
Wow, crazy. All right, so you have more sticky notes.
Oh, I have more sticky notes. I do. One of the other things that kind of caught my eye when I was reading this was the distinction, because, with founding, we just broken away, declared our independence from England, the glorious revolution in 1688 England, the terms of the people and how the British, the English looked at the people differently than Americans looked at the people.
Right. And the difference between their parliament and our representative system, I think, is born out of that, which is that kind of the English didn't see really in any practical way a difference between their parliamentary representatives and the people. They were one and the same. If they were serving, if people in the House of Commons were serving, then they were serving the interests of the people. Whereas from the very inception of the United States as an independent nation, and even arguably before that, during the Revolution itself, you had this understanding that there are the representatives of the people, but they still aren't the people themselves, and that's a very important distinction.
And that plays a lot into the whole intentionality of we the people for us.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and that is always the key, and we use that phrase constantly, and even in conversations, whether on the show or online or in person, almost ad nauseum, I will frequently keep going back to that. We the people, we the people, we the people. We the people have either allowed something to happen, or we the people need to be doing something. Because I'm kind of in that traditional historical standpoint. I'm like, okay, we need to understand why that phrase was originally used, like you just explained, in comparison to where we came from. And it's like, no, we can't and should not lose focus on why it is so important of we the people.
Right, and it's not that democracy is bad. It's about having the wisdom of knowing when to apply it.
Yes.
You know, like with the ratification of the Constitution. Again, I'm going into total historian mode here, but when each of the states ratified the convention, it didn't go to the state legislatures. Again, there was a difference between those who were currently representing them and the people themselves. That each state, each very young state, designed their own ratification conventions and created delegates voted for by the people. And so they bypassed the state legislatures, the state governments, to go directly to the people to see if the people wanted this new constitution. So you have really pure democracy in that regard. So nothing that I wrote or nothing that I'm saying is anti-democratic, to the extreme. It's about knowing, when to apply these things. And
I think it's a good point. You bring up wisdom, and I think just, are we wise anymore? I mean, when we look at this as a society, to look at this, when you break this all down and you really read it and understand it and digest it and understand this is how we were founded, this is how we should be operating, and we're so far away from that. Do we have the wisdom to come back to first principles?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. First principles, you have to be living in the same world as the person next to you.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like you said, with tribalism and everything else and progressivism, these are two